Have you ever struggled with your aim on a breezy, rainy, or cold day? You won't want to miss this episode. We'll be sharing some tips and techniques and common mistakes to avoid the problems you might have. So let's grab your bow, tune in, and let's conquer the bad weather together. Hi, my name is Roy Canterbury. I'll be your host today on Archery Talk 101. And today we're diving into an advanced topic that is crucial to outdoor archery. Understanding and judging for wind and weather conditions is a problem we'll all have to deal with sooner or later if we shoot outside. This knowledge can be slightly improved, can improve your accuracy and consistently, especially in outdoor competitions or hunting scenarios, where you're out in a competition and you can't always control what the weather's like. It's not always going to be a nice sunny day with, clear skies and no wind. Especially like if you're doing this in Nebraska. There's not many days we don't have some wind, or cloud or rain. Sometimes we have some pretty nasty weather, and if you got to compete, you got to compete, no matter what the weather is. Or if you're out hunting and that's your only day to hunt, you're going to have to hunt whatever the condition is. So let's take, uh, a little bit before we get started and dive into today's topic. I'll remind you where you can catch the podcast live in the Arch Talk 101 Facebook group. So those in the group, they're going to have access to making comments as we're going live and participate in the show. You can also catch replays in the Arch Talk 101 Facebook group. You can go out to archtalk101.com. There we have them, the videos as well as other things out there for you to watch and listen and learn from. You can also catch it on my YouTube channel, Learn to Fix It Yourself. And for those who want to listen on the go, the podcast is in audio on Spotify and audible.com. You can catch them both there. So then you can, not miss an episode while you're driving, just listen to the podcast. Now, understanding the effects of wind, that it can be from, not really much throw you off, maybe half inch to it could show you off by feet. So it all depends on what the wind condition is. It's going to affect your arrow flight, in one way or another. It's going to affect it. Either it's going to cause the arrow to drift off, its intended course, making a shot inaccurate. You're going to have to shoot into the wind. You're going to shoot upwind, downwind. You need to figure out what your equipment does in that situation. Different arrows are going to act differently. If you have something with big fletching on the back, it's going to act differently because it's going to push on the fletching more. So now then it may actually go into the wind, where something with not much in there might just drift the whole arrow left. So you need to know what your setup does. I shoot feathers, 4-inch feathers, so mine's probably going to drift a little bit more to point towards the wind. The arrow's going to coming in at that angle. The whole thing's probably going to be drifting left. So you just need to know what it does. It's going to cause it to go sideways one way or another. So that's what you need to figure out. And it can also if you have winds blowing in your face or at your back, it's going to cause your arrow to be slower because now it's going in, blowing in your face. It has to go into the wind, and so that's going to slow it down. If it's at your back, it's going to increase this because it's not going to have as much resistance to the wind because it's going to be going in. And the harder the wind, the more it's going to affect it. So that's something you want to do when you're looking at the different ways that wind affects your arrows. Now, there are some times when you probably don't want to be out there shooting at all. I know sometimes in Nebraska we might have 20, 30 mile an hour winds. That is not something you really want to shoot in because you can't stand up. Just you're getting blown one way or another, and you're trying to balance yourself as well as shooting your arrows. That can lead to punching a trigger. So if it's that windy, it's probably not really advisable to be out there. But if a wind comes up, learn to judge that wind. You want to observe it, and practice in the wind so you know what to do. You can look at the movement of leaves and grass and other, environmental cues to see what the wind is doing. If flags, are great. If there's a flag up, or say, there's going to be some wind, you're not sure, it kind of shifts to left or right. What's it doing where the animal is at? You could set up a little flag out there and see what the wind is doing. Now, of course, that may attract the attention of the deer you're looking at, but at least you'll know what the wind is doing on that day. Maybe it's blowing from your left right there where you're at by the trees, because you're in the trees and it's making it swirl around, gets out further, maybe blowing from the right. So you want to know what the wind is doing at different directions. And sometimes you can look at like I said, the cues, the grass, the leaves, and stuff like that to see what the wind is doing. It affects even a rifle, so it's definitely going to affect an arrow. Uh, Now you want to adjust your aim and shooting technique. That's a critical skill you need to learn is shooting in the wind. If the wind is coming from, say, your left, you might need to aim slightly to the right, or vice versa, depending on, like I said, about how's your setup, how's it affected by the wind. The stronger the wind, the more you need to adjust. That's something you need to remember in there. You might also look at changing your draw weight. A little faster bow is going to be a little bit get there a little quicker, not get as much time affected by the wind. Or you might use a heavier arrow, now that it's not going to blow it around as much as a real light arrow. But remember, on your draw weight, don't go above what you can comfortably shoot. So if you're at that comfortable rate, changing the draw weight is going to make it less uncomfortable for you to shoot, and then you're dealing with the wind. So, that may or may not be something you want to do. If you normally crank your bow down for, like outdoor 3D shoots, but you normally shoot higher than that, then maybe at that shoot you need to crank them up. But then you've got to change your sights. So unless you have a different set of sights, now you got to go in and resight everything in. So, changing draw weight can be an advantage, but it can also be a hindrance, because now everything changes once you change the weight of your bow, the draw weight. Same thing with heavier arrows or lighter arrows. If you go with a heavier or lighter arrow, you're going to drop different, which changes all your sight pins and all that kind of stuff. So that's something you want to look at, is like, how does your setup, I'd kind of recommend using one setup for everything. That way you learn how that setup works. You can say, okay, if I have a slight wind, I can just aim off just slightly off, into the wind. If I have a really strong wind, I know my arrow goes the other way, so I may have to shoot upwind. So that's something you just need to practice, and the different wind conditions at different ranges too. A 20-yard shot is going to be affected differently than a 30-yard shot, or a 15-yard shot, or 10-yard shot, or 50 or 60-yard shot. You need to know how those all affect your arrow flight. So that's what we want to do. Adjusting for the wind, practice shooting in the wind. Now, here's some other weather conditions that we run into when we're shooting outside. Besides having a bright sunny day, you might be looking into the sun. That might be a hindrance, because now especially with glasses, maybe the sun's glaring off your glasses, you can't see. So that's something you want to look at too as well. But let's get into more challenging one is you can always put a hat on and take care of that. Now, rain, that's something that you want to look at, or shooting in the cold. So, rain can make your equipment slippery. In cold weather, it can, hurt your dexterity. Your hands aren't as dexterous. If you're using a bow where you're shooting fingers, your fingers going to be, they're not going to be as flexible. They're going to maybe hurt more. If you're not wearing the proper glove or tab, you may end up, getting some cuts on your fingers, because your skin is just not as pliable when it's cold like that. You won't have as much feeling in your fingers. Shooting in the rain, when you have, a mechanical release, you're going to make sure that that is hooked on good, and everything there, but that's not quite so bad. But when you get in the cold, shooting cold with a mechanical release, you got to say, okay, how have lubricate? Have you lubricate with an oil that's gotten thick? Has it picked up a little grime in there? Do you have the sensitivity in your hands to feel the trigger, or if the handheld, feel that's at, your hands may cause that, problem with being in the cold. That's why I have a handheld I shoot until it gets really cold. I go to a caliper, um, type of fasten on my wrist, because then I can keep my hand warm. I only need just the index finger out of the glove. Where my handheld, I need, pretty much my whole hand needs to be basically out of into the weather. So, when it's in the rain, how is your arrows affected? Arrows can be affected by adding more water to it, adds more weight, there's more resistance. So shooting in the rain can cause lots of other problems. Now, for those of us that shoot feathers, your feathers get wet and they kind of disappear. They kind of, shrivel up. Or veins, they don't do that. So if you do shoot in a lot of bad weather, you're in an area where you have lots and lots of rain during your hunting season, you may want to go to a vane. Right. I shoot a feather, year round, just because that's how I started and I just didn't want to change. Cold and wet can also affect your equipment as well. One of the things you want to look at is, as your equipment gets wet, are you picking up, do you have a peep sight? Is it getting rain in there, making it hard to see through, or your sight's getting rain on it? Does your rest everything, if it's a little rainy and then right there at that rain freeze time, you might be getting sleet, you have a drop way rest. As you pull back, is that going to hang up because, it got a little wet and then now it froze? So that's something you need to look at too is what is your equipment doing when it gets really cold? Does it get stiff when it get cold? Your limbs are stiffer when it gets cold. So it may feel like you're pulling more weight. You get stiffer in the cold. So now then you have a problem. It's like, okay, you're stiff, you're not warmed up, you're not gonna be able to pull as much weight. And that actually happened to me one time where I was shooting throughout the summer and come hunting season. I basically didn't do much shooting because I had my bow set up to shoot my broadhead, so I didn't really practice much. So one morning I got out there and it was cold. I climbed on my tree stand and I always like to draw my bow back, put an arrow in it, draw it back, make sure everything's okay. I went to draw it back and I couldn't get it pulled back. I struggled and I struggled and I struggled and I just couldn't get it pulled back. And I strained some muscles or something while I was doing that. So I said, well, either I go home or I sit here. So I sat there for a while and I was able to warm up a little bit and I was able to draw my bow, but I'd already hurt some muscles and it was a little bit sore, but I was able to shoot. That's one thing you want to keep doing when it gets to wintertime. Don't quit practicing. If nothing else, if you're at your house, put up a bag target and draw back and let down. Just keep drawing back. And if it's where you can shoot, go ahead and draw and shoot. Just kind of keep that strength up because that's something that will drop. And then also in the cold, it helps, kind of deter that a little bit, that ability to shoot really well. And the biggest key is you want to shoot in different weather conditions. So try shooting on a windy day, or if you don't have outdoor, you're shooting indoors, and put up a fan, and blow on it so it's kind of blowing. Not gonna be like outdoors, but it'll be something that kind of help getting that feeling that wind blowing in your face and seeing what it does as you're shooting. Because if all of a sudden you're gonna draw, used to being okay, and all of a sudden that wind's blowing, it's a little bit of cool and it blows and makes your eyes water. And now then what do you do? How do you take care of that? So that's something you want to practice in is the more you practice different weather conditions, the more if it comes up, it's like, yeah, I already done it. It's like, oh, no big, I know what to do. That's kind of what you want to do is practice in those various conditions. Some of the common mistakes that you can make, on windy days and rainy days and cold days, um, you know, shooting in that wind, it can be challenging and it's easy to make your mistakes. Some of the common mistakes that you might make is misjudging the wind strength and direction. That's what we talked about earlier. You need to know which way the wind's blowing, how your equipment works in it. So, but if you misjudge that, you're going to not have a good shot. Now, one of the keys is, lots of times when the wind's blowing, it'll die down and then it'll pick back up. Well, wait for that to die down and shoot. Lots of times you got plenty of time to shoot, so it's not a big deal. Now, in a book I was reading or listening to on Audible by Maxwell Maltz, Psycho-Cybernetics, he talks about a condition where he was a top shooter and everything else. He's got a whole story. You have to listen to that book, but he was telling about a time when he had never shot in the wind, and he's out there in the wind. Now this is shooting rifles, and the guy next to him, was just plinking and plinking and was shooting in there's a it wasn't rain, it was in the snow, so he couldn't even see his target. And he noticed the guy next to him he'd pull up and shoot, and clunk, he'd hit his target. So he finally figured out that what he was doing was there's little gaps in it so he could see his target. So he'd line up on that target that short period of time when he had to line up on a target and shoot. So that's what might have to do if you have a cloudy day, or a foggy day, or rain, or wind. wait for a little break in it, and then that might be your chance to go ahead and shoot. It's something that you want to do is take a look at the different things that, can happen. Um, you know, one of the things that, we talked about here is aiming directly at the target instead of into the wind. The wind's blowing, your arrow's not going to go where you're aiming. And that's the part we need. That's the part that's really hard to adjust to and figure out if you haven't shot in the wind. What does your arrow do? Do you have to aim into the wind? Do you have to aim down for the wind? What do you have to do? Normally you're gonna aim into the direction of the wind. So if the wind's blowing from your right, you're going to aim slightly to the right, but how much are you need to go off? And if you have gusts, all of a sudden, you have a gust and then you shoot just for the gust. Now that's going to throw it off, and then you wait. So there's a lot of things in that can go along with, shooting in the wind. I prefer not to if I have a choice, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Now, what you may do is you may be able to adjust your equipment on windy conditions. So say, you're going to have a 10-mile-an-hour wind, and it's always going to be at that 10, it's rough. That's kind of the day. It's almost a constant wind. You don't have to worry about it. So maybe what you might want to do is, okay, the wind is blowing from my right. I know my equipment, I have to shoot to the right on about this, say it's 10-mile-an-hour wind. You practice in 10-mile-an-hour wind and say, okay, I need to aim just a little bit to the right. Now, if you have more than one bow, you could set one up and say, okay, this is my windy bow. When it's windy out, I'm going to shoot a heavier arrow so it doesn't get affected by the wind as much. So then you can go through and figure out, what do you want to do for setup? If you only have one bow, I would shoot one setup and don't worry about it. Just figure out how your bow acts in different conditions. In the rain, your equipment is going to be slipperier. So maybe your hand moves, it doesn't sit in there right. It's, once the slip, your equipment can not work quite as well as it normally does. Your string, if you don't have it waxed real well, can absorb some water. That's why we need to wax the string quite a bit, is to keep that going. And then other things going on. So, rain is a little bit different. Maybe your peep sight is filling up with water. Your glasses are getting wet from the rain. Wearing a hat helps with that. But if you don't have, if it's blowing in the wrong direction, you're going to get rain on your glasses anyway. So now you draw back and see if you're peep and you got rain on there. So now how do you take care of that? Because you got one hand on the release, one hand on the bow. How do you get to the rain off your glasses? You can't really shake your head because it doesn't seem to want to go. So, how do you account for something like that? That's something you can look at. And now let's talk about cold. That's another condition that is real challenging to shoot in. Not only do you have bulkier clothes, you have real bulky clothes on. That's why I shoot just a half inch shorter than my normal draw length, because now then my big bulky sleeves on my big heavy coats, I don't hit the string on them. Because if you hit the string on them, then it affects your arrow. Your arrow shoots way off, and now you're not hitting your target. And also, keeping your hands warm. I have a handheld release that I use when it's warmer weather, because I don't have really much on my hand as far as a glove. My palms got a little bit, my back of my hands a little bit, but basically my fingers are pretty much all open. It's one of those little fingertip ones that are gone, but just kind of all worn out, and I can feel the trigger in between my index finger and my thumb, and I can feel the trigger on my fingers, or the grip on my fingers. So when it gets really cold, I go to a wrist strap. And the only thing I need out is my index finger. The rest can stay warm. I can keep it in my pocket. I don't have to worry about, it's all nice and warm. I just got one finger out, and you can deal with that. So that's one thing to do in the cold. Now, your bow is going to feel a little stiffer to pull back, because now it's cold instead of being warm. Shooting on a hot day, the limb's going to be, a little softer. Cold, they're a little bit harder. Maybe not much, but enough that it could affect it a little bit. Those really hot days, it's completely different than shooting on them cold days. So you want to maintain your equipment, make sure it's in good condition, know how it works in the cold. Do you have a little bit of a grease on something that keeps it from smoothly working when it gets cold? That's some of the things you want to do. You want to practice in various conditions as well. So that's one of the things to the best way to improve your shooting is to practice in those conditions that you don't really want to shoot in, because that is when you're going to work on the things that is going to keep you from, making those mistakes when you're out hunting, or shooting 3D targets, or just shooting outdoors. You want to practice in those different conditions and make sure that you keep going with the different conditions practice. Besides, it can be challenging to shooting those, but it's better to practice in those conditions than it is to all of a sudden come up in that condition. Those listening live heard me tell the story, but I'm going to tell it because I somehow I turned off my mic so he wasn't even listening to me. But I was listening to an Audible book uh, on about this guy that was shooting Olympic level shooting, and he was shooting against another guy, and it was snowing, and you couldn't see the targets. And the guy next to him, he was shooting, hitting the targets. He couldn't figure out. So he looked at him. What he noticed was there'd be little gaps in the snow where you could see the target. So then he'd line up. So basically, he watched the other guy and said, okay, he's seeing a gap. So he draw back, he'd get ready to aim. And it was an archer, it was in a firearm, but he knew that there was a gap coming. And sure enough, he was able to hit the target because he's seen his gap. So the point of this story is if it's raining, you might need to wait for a little bit of condition change, or if it's windy, pay attention to what the wind's doing. If all of a sudden the wind's dying down, that's your time to shoot. If it's a constant blowing, then you're just gonna have to go with what you can do. But if let's say you're at full draw and the wind's blowing in your face, and you're leaning into it, and all of a sudden the wind stops, next thing you know, you start leaning back. So now if you happen to, that's the time you shot, now you're leaning back, so now you're moving. So that's something you want to pay attention to, is how is your body being affected by that wind as well? The stronger the wind, the more it's affected, the more you have to lean into it. I remember one time I was riding a motorcycle, and it was in the wind was blowing really hard from the side, and my bike is laying over at probably about a 30 or 40-degree angle just to go straight down the road. And normally if you lean that much, you're making a turn, but the wind was blowing so hard that you had to lean over that far just to keep it, because it wanted to push you to the right, so you're basically turning left. But the problem with that is all of a sudden if the wind stops, now it sends you off to the way you're leaning. So now next thing you know is you're up and down, and that's the same thing we're going to have when we have high wind conditions, is you're going to be bouncing around all the time. And let's kind of go over a little bit of the common mistakes that you might make, in windy conditions. You know, One is misjudging the wind. You need to learn what the wind does, and if you think it's a 10-mile wind, it's actually a 20-mile wind. And which direction? Maybe you think it's coming from your left, but it's actually coming from behind you and left. So learn to judge that. Where that's at. And then one of the things, not waiting for that wind to die down. If you got a point where it's going to die down, wait for it. Um, you know, Not waiting for that wind to die down can, if it's a constant one, then you can shoot during that same wind, then it's okay. But if you have all of a sudden it drops off, like I was talking about, we have a problem there. Now, in a windy condition, you don't want to aim right at the center of your target. The wind is going to push the arrow somewhere. Whether it's to the left or right, up or down. If it's behind you, it's going to push it up. If it's coming from in front of you, it's going to push it down. And all that. That's something you want to do. Now then, if you need to adjust your conditions, if there's something you can adjust for those wind conditions, then you want to look at that and go ahead and make the adjustments if you need to. If you have a adjustable sight and say, okay, with this wind condition from behind me, I know I'm going to be shooting high, so I need to shoot a little bit less. I may need to shoot it for 2 or 3 yards less, or it's in front of me, I need to shoot it for 2 or 3 yards more. So, that's something that you can adjust, but you need to know and practice in those windy conditions to help that. Now, one of the things, let's kind of go over a little bit, a little bit more detail of some of the things that you can do when shooting in rain. After you understand adjusting for the wind, there's some other factors that can affect your performance in the rain. Shooting in the rain is challenging, but the right preparation, you can still maintain accuracy and enjoy, the archery session, or tournament or whatever you're in. Now, here's some tips that I'm going to go over on shooting in the rain. One, you want to check your form because wet clothes or slippery grips, that can alter your form. Make sure you maintain that proper form. If your clothes are wet, maybe it's feeling heavy on your hand or your arm or something. So you need to make sure that you're there, or you're, it's wet enough and it's actually sticking to your body a little bit. You're not as flexible, you're not moving in the right position. So you want to check your form. One of the things that really helps is, when you assess the wind speed. Rain is often accompanied by wind. Make sure you assess the wind speed as well as adjusting for the rain. So now then you have two factors to deal with in the rain. When it's raining, the rain and the wind. So yeah, got to compensate for that. Now you might want to reduce some of your movement when you're shooting in the rain. When you draw, try reducing the range, to prevent slipping. Because if you're on a slippery surface, say if you're on a 3D shoot and you're outside and you're on a little bit of a hill, now you're standing on a slick hill. If it's got grass on it, you got a little bit, but you could be slipping. So you want to make sure that you have a good footing when you're in there so that you're not slipping around as you're drawing. And don't do a lot of movement when you're going up there. Just kind of keep the minimum so you can keep your footing. Um, you know, you want to aim low if it's raining because it's going to slow down your arrow. Because as it comes in and hits the rain and it catches on there, it's going to add more weight to it. It's also got more resistance. So you're going to drop down a little bit slow. And some of your equipment might need, you want to keep it from getting wet. So you might need to put a little oil or something on something just so that it doesn't soak into it or get inside. That's something you want to look at. Where can you put something to prevent water from getting inside? Uh, and then, when you do shoot in the rain, you, when you come home, you're going to put it in your bow case. The first thing you do, you get home, you want to take it out of the bow case, open your bow case so it can dry, so your bow can dry off, and then dry it off so that you don't have any water sitting on it because like the bolts and stuff like that, they can rust because they're steel. Your risers they're all aluminum, so they're not going to rust. But you want to make sure you don't have any rust forming on your string. Make sure you dry your string. Make sure that your strings and cables are dry. Dry off everything you can and let it hang until it's dry. Now, if you've waxed your string like you should be, you don't have to worry about the rain on the string. Just wipe it down. And once it gets all dry, so it's not wet from being in the rain. Now then go ahead and put another coat of wax on your string and cables. There's a lot of different ones out there for that. There's a lot of good lubricants where you can use that. So now, if you are out in the rain, one of the things is try to keep your equipment dry. Now that's sometimes can be the big challenge is try and keep it dry. If you're in the rain, it's going to get wet, but try to keep it as dry as you can. I know with me shooting feathers, if the feathers get wet, they kind of fall apart. They don't fall apart, but I mean, they just kind of shrink down to almost nothing. Now, once they dry out, they're okay, or you can always steam them to get them back and stuff like that. But there is some stuff you can put on your feathers to prevent it from doing that. Or if I'm out hunting, I have my one arrow that's getting wet. I have my other one sitting in my quiver where they're not getting wet. And then I'll just switch them out. If it gets where it's kind of shrinking, switch them out. Now, if you're shooting with vanes, which I think most people are, unless you're shooting traditional equipment, they're shooting with vanes and they don't have that problem with that. But all you have to do is maybe just tap the shaft on your hand and make sure you're not getting your hand by the broadhead, and then knock off your water off of it. I've seen people shooting when their stuff's all wet and there's just this mist of water just flying all over the place when they shoot because all that water comes off the arrow and off the bow, and now then it's going to be collecting more water as it's going. So that's just something. It's kind of cool to watch. A video of somebody shooting when their equipment's all wet. One of probably the best things for you is to consider some waterproof boots if you don't already have them. A hunting umbrella is something that you can use while you're out to help you stay out of the sun, out of the rain. If it's raining, it keeps you dry. The other thing is for those that have a blind or like to shoot on a blind, blinds are great for that because uh, unless it's blowing directly into the front of it, you're going to stay pretty dry. The one thing you have to think about though is are you on a hill where the rain could be coming down and going underneath your tent, or the blind? So other than that, the blinds are really good for shooting in windy conditions, shooting in rainy conditions, shooting in the cold, because you can stay a lot warmer because you don't have the wind on you. Um, Sometimes you even get those little heaters, and you know keep it warm inside. Uh, the only thing you have to think about too is not shooting through your blind because you got to realize the arrow is down lower than where your sights are. So that's something you have to think about inside of a blind. But that's something that you can do. Um, you know, practice. Any aspect of archery, you need to practice. Try shooting in the rain, get used to different conditions. It's kind of miserable shooting in the rain, but if you're out hunting and all of a sudden it's raining, you might need to do that. Um, I know one time it was raining when we get ready to go out. My son and I and the other guy I hunt with, we were going out. They said it's supposed to stop by, shortly after sunrise. It didn't stop. And then it's like, well, okay, it's supposed to stop, an hour later. And nope, still not. And it was like hour and a half, 2 hours later, it still was raining. We said, forget it. We're not going to hunt anymore in the rain because you can't trail them very well. You got to look at footprints. And I did that one time. I was one of the guys that hunting with. He called and says, "Hey, I'm gonna go hunting tomorrow." And I said, "It's or that night. It was raining that night." And I knew if I didn't go, he's gonna sit in my tree stand and shoot a deer. So I went. It wasn't a hard rain. It was kind of a light rain, and sure enough, I shot a deer out of that tree stand because I knew he was going to sit in there. So I shot a deer, and I get down and I'm not really finding any blood, but I'm finding footprints in the mud. So I followed basically my footprints, to get to it. So that's kind of the problem with shooting in the rain is trailing. So let's get into a couple of things on cold weather shooting. Cold weather, yeah, that does prevent a unique challenge. Here's some common mistakes that you shooting cold that you might want to think about. Wearing bulky clothes. Thick, bulky clothes can interfere with your bowstring. That's why I shoot just a little bit shorter. My draw length's 29 and a half. I shoot 29 because that extra half inch makes it a little bit shorter. I shoot that all year round, and now I don't need to put an arm guard on my arm to keep that bulky jacket out of the way. It doesn't hit it. Um, if you got that bulky clothes, you might need to put an arm guard on just to keep it fitting close to your arm so you don't hit. I know one time I shot and it was before I knew anything about this and my draw length was way too long and I heard it hit my arm and I didn't feel it because it just hit the clothes enough to affect the arrow. So the arrow went from basically a good shot right at the lungs to back in the hip, hit the hip. Um, so that's how much difference. And this is, not even, this is probably, I think it was like a 10 or 15-yard shot and it missed by that much by catching my arm. Uh, you know, anything that hits that bow is going to affect it. I shot at another deer one time in a tree stand. I was sitting down instead of standing up like I normally do, and I didn't realize it. But my bow was at that time was just long enough. When I shot, that bottom limb caught just enough of the tree stand that it dropped it way down, and this was another 10-yard shot. I missed it by 5 feet. So there's things that you got to pay attention to. What can go on when you have that big bulky clothes on. You know, that's why it's nice if you have kind of form-fitting clothes. It's going to keep you warm. There are some new clothes out now. Actually, on one of the podcasts, I talked to one of the guys that has some of those new clothes. They're very thin and very warm, and they'll keep you warm in a lot of conditions. You don't have to have that bulk. That's something you might want to think about on that. Now, one of the things too is you need to practice in that heavy clothes. A little tough to do in the summertime because it gets so hot. But like practice in the spring, before it gets summertime, when it's still cool out, get out there and shoot. because it's going to change your anchor point. It's going to change everything, your proper form. It can change all that if you're not careful with what you're doing, your clothes. If you have an anchor point where you're anchoring onto your face and you have a big heavy baklava on or something, a big heavy mask on, you can't get your hand back to that point because you've got, eighth inch or so gap that you can't get to your face because of what you have on there. If you have a hooded coat on, how do you get that hand underneath that coat? You can't put it on the outside because now you're anchored further away from your face. So that's something you need to look at. It's like, how can I get my proper form and be able to, shoot in the cold weather? One of the things you need to make sure you maintain your equipment. If you ignore some of your cold weather conditions, you know, yeah, making sure your bow is tuned right, maintain, and maintain for the cold. See how your bow shoots in the cold and as opposed to the hot. If you're out doing a 3D shoot and it's 90 or 100 degrees out, your bow is going to act differently than if you're out shooting at a hunting conditions when it's, you know, 20 degrees out. Your bow's going to act differently. So you need to know how that acts differently. Now, in the cold, one thing that a lot of people don't think about is if you're exhaling and you're breathing on your bowstring, you get moisture on there, and that can freeze. Like you see some of those guys, mustaches when they're out in the or beards, you're out in the wintertime and the icicles are just forming on your mustache and your beard. That's because as you're breathing, the moisture from your breath is freezing it's collecting onto your hairs, and then it's freezing. Same thing on a bowstring. If you breathe on your bowstring, it could cause, ice to form, and freeze your string. Now, generally, we're not breathing directly on our string, but that's something to think about too. Is what do you have going on there? And then probably the biggest thing that's going to cause you a problem is not staying warm. And we talked about, wearing bulky clothes. You need to be warm. Uh, but if you're getting cold, your muscles are stiff, and that can affect your shooting. Like I talked about earlier, I had at a time when I was out shooting, it was cold, and I couldn't draw my bow back. I ended up pulling a muscle, and then warm up a little bit later. So that can affect the thing. So if you stay warm, that's going to help with that. Keeping that appropriate clothes, and then you know if you can stay a little bit more active between shots. If you're on a 3D course, no big deal. You're always active. But if you're hunting, how do you keep, you know, still, but yet keep moving? And, as you sit there in the cold, you get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. And then as you get older and older, you get stiffer and stiffer quicker. So, the muscles just don't cooperate quite as well. So that's kind of what I want to talk about here. Those listening live, heard some of it a couple times, but the recording, I'll have to edit out the part where I was talking and he couldn't hear me. Somehow I ended up hitting the wrong key or something, muted the microphone. But um, thank you for tuning in today. Today's episode where we covered some advanced aspects of archery, from understanding wind and weather conditions to shooting in the rain and cold. Remember, you can catch our live this we can catch this podcast live in the Archery Talk 101 Facebook group. You also have access to replays in there because they're saved in there. You can also get it on archtalk101.com. I have them there. And you can also catch the video replays on my YouTube channel, Learn to Fix It Yourself. And those, if you prefer to listen to the podcast instead of watching it, you can go out to Spotify. It's out there, as well as a couple of places. And you can also go to audible.com, and there you can connect in, look for Archery Talk 101, and just connect in and listen to the podcast there. I have several people I know that's how they listen to it, is there. Stay tuned for our next episode. We're gonna go into a little bit more fine tuning the mental game for archery. So we're going to go into a little bit more mental aspects in there and cover some of that stuff. So that'll be the next podcast. So make sure you stay tuned for that one. That'll come out here either on a Monday or Friday, depending on which day this one comes out. So we'll listen to that. Make sure you catch that. Now, next time, just make sure you keep all these conditions in mind when you get ready to go out there and practice those different conditions in the wind, in the rain, in sunny days, cloudy days, all the different types of weather that you can have. Best if you can get out there in those and practice and then make it really good. So thank you for joining us on this journey through the elements of archery. I'm Roy Canterbury. I've been your host today, and it's been a pleasure guiding you through these techniques and helping you improve your archery skills. Don't forget to look out for our next podcast. That's where we're going to be diving into the more of the mental aspect of archery. And thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.